Blood soaks the dry plain of Apulia. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers are trapped, pressed tighter and tighter into a circle of death. The air is thick with dust and terror as Hannibal's forces close in from every side. This is not a battle anymore. It's a massacre. But how did it come to this? Let's rewind to see how one of the greatest tactical victories in history unfolded at Cannae. In 218 BC, the Second Punic War erupted between the rising Republic of Rome and the powerful Carthaginian Empire. The First Punic War had ended with Carthage humiliated, losing Sicily and paying heavy reparations. But now, a new Carthaginian general had emerged, Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, raised from childhood to hate Rome. Hannibal began the war with a bold and unexpected move. He marched his army from Iberia across the Alps into northern Italy. Against all odds, he brought elephants and a multi-ethnic force through freezing mountain passes, stunning the Romans with his audacity. In the years that followed, Hannibal humiliated Rome again and again. At Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and a series of ambushes, he shattered Roman legions and morale. The Senate was shaken, the people terrified. But Rome was not done. Determined to crush Hannibal once and for all, they raised the largest army in Roman history. The Roman Republic sent two consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, each commanding half of a massive force. Waiting for them was Hannibal. Outnumbered but not outthought. The plain of Cannae was wide, flat, and largely unobstructed, ideal terrain for massive armies and cavalry maneuvering. Dusty, open ground stretched in every direction. There were no forests, hills, or natural barriers to exploit. The only notable landmark was the Aufidus River to the north of Hannibal's position, providing a modest water source but no real tactical value. This was a battleground chosen for movement, for sweeping maneuvers, and for decisive action. On the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, two enormous armies stood face to face, ready to determine the fate of Italy. The Roman Republic had committed everything it had to this confrontation. Their force numbered between 80,000 and 86,000 men, making it the largest army Rome had ever assembled up to that point. Of this number, around 50,000 were heavy infantry, Roman legionaries and allied Italian troops, organized into the manipular system, but deployed in unusually deep formations for this battle. Another 8,000 were light infantry, including velites and skirmishers, who typically operated in front of the main line to disrupt the enemy before the primary clash. The cavalry component numbered between 6,000 and 8,000, a mix of Roman equites and allied Italian horsemen. This enormous force was commanded jointly by the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. The two alternated command daily, and on this fateful day, it was Varro, known for his aggressive temperament, who held supreme authority. Hannibal's army, in contrast, was smaller in number but vastly superior in experience, cohesion, and tactical diversity. He had roughly 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry under his command. His infantry was a multinational corps of battle-hardened troops. At the center stood his Spanish and Gallic infantry, who were less armored but fiercely loyal and highly capable. Behind them, and anchoring both flanks, were his elite African infantry, heavily armed veterans trained to fight in a style resembling the Roman legions they had already bested in earlier campaigns. Hannibal's cavalry was divided between two distinct forces. On his left flank, Hasdrubal led about 6,500 heavy cavalry. mostly Gauls and Iberians known for their strength in close combat. On the right flank, Hanno commanded around 3,500 Numidian light cavalry who were fast, elusive, and skilled at harassment and disruption. Hannibal himself took up a position near the center of the line, personally overseeing the unfolding of his plan. The Roman objective was simple. With their overwhelming manpower, they intended to drive directly into the Carthaginian center and break Hannibal's line through sheer brute force. To that end, they packed their heavy infantry into a tight, dense formation, much deeper than standard Roman deployments. This effectively sacrificed the flexibility of the manipular system in favor of crushing strength. Their cavalry was placed on the flanks. The Roman cavalry, roughly 2,400 strong, was stationed on their right under Paulus. On the left, Varro commanded the Italian allied cavalry, which numbered around 3,600. They had the numbers, and they believed it would be enough. But Hannibal had something else in mind. His formation was deceptively simple and designed to entrap. In the center, he placed his Gallic and Spanish infantry in a shallow outward bulge, creating a convex crescent shape that extended toward the Romans. Behind them, and slightly recessed on both flanks, he held back his African veterans. They weren't visible to the Roman front at first, positioned just behind the bulging line. His cavalry, as noted, anchored both ends of the formation, Hasdrubal with the heavy cavalry on the left, Hanno with the Numidians on the right. Crucially, Hannibal stationed his center forward, intentionally exposing it to the brunt of the Roman assault. It looked like a vulnerable line, but it was bait. The real strength was hidden at the edges, waiting for the moment to close. The battle began, as most ancient battles did, with the light infantry exchanging missiles. Roman velites and Carthaginian skirmishers launched javelins, slung stones, and fired arrows. But this phase was largely indecisive. As the skirmishers pulled back, the Roman main line surged forward. Thousands of legionaries advanced toward Hannibal's curved center. The Gallic and Spanish infantry held firm, meeting the charge with disciplined resistance. But after initial contact, they began to fall back. This was not panic. It was calculated. They withdrew step by step, maintaining their formation as they gave ground. The bulging crescent began to collapse inward, transforming from convex to flat, and then into a shallow concave arc. The Romans thought they were winning. From their perspective, the enemy was retreating under pressure, so they pressed harder. In reality, they were pushing themselves into a trap. The deeper they advanced, the more compressed and elongated their formation became. Thousands of Romans were now squeezed into a tightening corridor between two yet unengaged Carthaginian wings. Still they advanced, believing victory was at hand. While this slow collapse unfolded in the center, something far more immediate was happening on the flanks. On the Roman right, the cavalry led by Paulus was already under heavy assault. Hasdrubal's cavalry had charged with overwhelming force. These were seasoned fighters, and they slammed into the Roman equities with ferocity. Outnumbered and outmatched, the Roman cavalry began to break. Paulus himself was wounded and removed from the front. Within a short time, the Roman right flank had collapsed. Hasdrubal didn't waste a moment. Instead of chasing down fleeing cavalry, he regrouped and led his men across the rear of the Roman infantry formation, charging toward the Roman left flank. There, the Italian allied cavalry under Varro was still engaged with Hanno's Numidians. The Numidians had been using their typical tactics, circling, throwing javelins, and avoiding direct contact, essentially keeping the Italians busy. Now, with Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry arriving from behind, the Italian cavalry was hit from two directions at once. They stood no chance. The left flank collapsed just as quickly as the right. In a matter of minutes, Hannibal's cavalry had seized total control of the battlefield. Back in the center, the Roman infantry had continued to push forward. The enemy line, now fully concave, had drawn them deep into the formation. They were beginning to lose cohesion, unable to maneuver in the narrowing space. Then, at the moment Hannibal had been waiting for, he gave the order. The African infantry, until now hidden on the flanks and slightly behind the line, pivoted inward. With discipline and precision, they struck the exposed sides of the Roman mass. This wasn't a distant flanking maneuver. It was a sudden ambush from close quarters. The African veterans crashed into the Roman flanks with deadly force, hacking into the tightly packed soldiers who had no room to react. The Roman formation, designed for pressure and depth, had become a death trap. They were now under assault from three sides: front, left, and right. With no space to maneuver or break out, panic began to set in, and the worst was still to come. Surrounded on three sides, the Roman legions still fought with determination. Thousands of them, veterans and allies alike, believed sheer discipline and force could break the trap they had marched into. But Hannibal's encirclement was only tightening. As the African infantry pressed inward from both flanks and the Spanish Gallic troops continued holding in front, the Romans began to lose all sense of structure. Their manipular formation, already compressed, had now disintegrated into a dense, shapeless mass of bodies, weapons, and confusion. Then came the final seal of their doom. Hasdrubal and his victorious cavalry, having destroyed both Roman wings, now returned, not to chase down fleeing horsemen, but to complete the trap. They rode behind the Roman rear and dismounted or charged directly into the back of the Roman infantry block, closing off the only direction left unchallenged. The Roman army was now completely surrounded. It is difficult to overstate the horror that followed. Tens of thousands of soldiers, trapped in a shrinking pocket of death, began to die, not in battle lines, but in suffocating chaos. They couldn't move, couldn't swing their swords, couldn't even raise shields effectively. Many died without even seeing who struck them. Hannibal's forces had turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse, and their advantage wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The Romans, realizing they were encircled, panicked. Some tried to break out. Others begged for a quarter, most simply fought and fell where they stood. Contemporary sources describe the fighting lasting for several hours. What began in the early morning stretched well into the afternoon. Some Roman units reportedly stacked their dead into makeshift barricades, trying to create space to breathe or defend themselves. Others stood still, immobilized in the crush of bodies. Hannibal's troops rotated their front ranks, allowing fresh soldiers to continue the killing, while exhausted ones pulled back for rest. It was methodical, it was relentless. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, wounded earlier in the cavalry collapse, remained on the field. He refused to flee and was eventually cut down, possibly by Gallic cavalry. Another Roman commander, the former consul Servilius Geminus, also died in the fighting. Gaius Terentius Varro, the surviving consul who had commanded the day's operations, managed to escape with a few hundred cavalry and would later be criticized and defended in equal measure. Some said he was cowardly. Others claimed he preserved the only surviving Roman force that day. The losses were staggering. According to Polybius, nearly 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed at Cannae. Another 10,000 were taken prisoner. only about 3,000 escaped. Livy, writing later, offers slightly lower estimates but still confirms the same catastrophic proportions. Among the dead were 80 senators, or former magistrates, almost a third of the Roman political class, and over 300 members of the Roman equestrian order. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a massacre of the Roman elite. Carthaginian losses, by contrast, were remarkably low. Hannibal lost around 6,000 men, mostly among the Gallic and Spanish troops in the initial center engagement. His cavalry and African infantry suffered minimal casualties. He had used the enemy's strength against them, allowed them to walk into a trap, and then buried them under it. When the dust settled, the field at Cannae was silent, save for the groans of the dying. The river Aufidus ran dark. Piles of corpses littered the plains. The smell of blood and decay would hang over the area for days. Yet for Hannibal, this was the high water mark. Cannae was not just a military victory, it was a masterpiece of battlefield tactics. His double envelopment maneuver, the encirclement of a numerically superior army, has since become one of the most studied tactics in military history. No army of that size had ever been so completely surrounded and annihilated in open combat. But while the victory was total, Hannibal's next move remains one of the most debated questions in Roman history. After the battle, he did not march on Rome. His cavalry commander Maharbal urged it, saying, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use it." Hannibal, perhaps aware of the logistical impossibility of besieging Rome without siege equipment or supply lines, declined. Instead, he hoped the Italian allies of Rome would defect and that the Republic would collapse politically. Some cities did surrender to him. Most did not. The Roman response, astonishingly, was not to negotiate peace. Despite losing nearly 120,000 men at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and now Cannae, the Senate resolved to keep fighting. They banned public mourning, refused to ransom prisoners, and raised new legions composed of freed slaves, boys, and old men. The Republic, bloodied but unbroken, steeled itself for total war. In the immediate aftermath, Carthage's influence in southern Italy grew. Capua, the second largest city in the peninsula, defected to Hannibal. Other towns followed, but Rome dug in. The Fabian strategy of avoidance returned. Hannibal would never again fight another battle on Italian soil as decisive as Cannae. And over the following decade, the tide slowly turned against him. Still, the psychological shock of Cannae was immense. No Roman commander forgot it. The Senate remembered it for generations. Even centuries later, when the Roman Empire expanded across Europe and into the East, military generals studied Cannae as the cautionary tale, the battle that showed how numbers, pride, and inflexibility could doom an army. And Hannibal? He would become a legend, a general whose genius peaked that day on a dusty plain in Apulia, a man who crushed the might of Rome in a single afternoon, but whose war, though filled with victories, would ultimately end in defeat. Cannae remains not just one of the greatest tactical victories in history. It remains a haunting reminder of what happens when boldness meets brilliance,